Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. The North Suburban Library District and Klehm Arboretum and Botanic Garden are pleased to present this program for you. Samantha Burbach is the Director of Education and Programming at Klehm Arboretum and Botanic Garden, and she will give you some helpful tips on creating interesting and successful container gardens.
Hello, thank you so much for inviting me to do this program. As mentioned, my name is Sam, and I'm the Director of Education and Programming at Clem, and I really just wanted to share some tips and some ideas for making fun container gardens now that we are getting close to that time of year where we can really start doing that again. So to start off, why would we bother to garden in containers when we have the ground to work with, when we can just have a landscape? And containers are very popular for many reasons, and the main one being they're just perfect for limited space. So if you only have a deck or a patio, or you don't have access to a garden space where you can plant in the ground, containers are really your solution. It's a great way to bring some flowers and some plant interest to areas where you don't have landscaping to work with, whether you are in an apartment or just have that balcony, or even if you do have a big landscape but you want a nice container right by your front door or on your porch, or a balcony where you can enjoy some extra interest. So it allows you to move plants around to places where you normally couldn't have them, and just gives you so much opportunity. So containers are really your friend when you're trying to expand your garden. They're relatively low maintenance, which is always great. You don't have to worry about tilling up your garden or your yard. You don't have to rip up your lawn. There's not much deep digging to do, and your weeds are going to be pretty minimal if you're starting with some nice clean potting mix. So that aspect of the maintenance is really easy. The other great thing is containers are raised off the ground. So if it is difficult to get all the way down on your hands and knees to be working in a garden or in your landscape, containers allow you to raise that garden up, so it is a little bit easier to work in. And that helps when you're planting, when you're maybe deadheading some flowers or just cleaning it up a little bit. It's always helpful to have that extra little bit of elevation. They're easy to change out, so you can experiment with more plants from year to year or even season to season. So you can have a nice spring container and then switch it up for summer, change it up again for fall. And then in the winter, where we're not able to grow things outside in our area, you can still use that container for some cut evergreens to bring a little bit of plant life still to your outdoor spaces when we're usually covered in snow like we are now. And then also, it's a little bit easier to control disease when it's confined to a smaller space. So it's not going to be able to spread throughout a garden space. And again, it's easy to, if you've got something like some downy mildew or something on the foliage, it's easier to clean that up and take care of it quicker. And it's going to keep your plants contained to that space, so that way we don't have as much spread. These are just a few of the pros of using container gardens. There's obviously a lot more, and there's also a few downsides that you can work with or find ways to work around. Container gardening can get a little bit expensive depending on how fancy of a container you want to use, how often you want to change out the plants, how often you change out the soil, or how much soil you need in general. We'll touch on that a little bit, but there are ways to make it you don't have to have a super elaborate container. We'll talk about ways to kind of hide the actual container. And so it doesn't have to become too expensive. And the other thing I like to point out from the get-go is that it is relatively low maintenance, but when it comes to watering and fertilizing, it does take a little bit more effort, especially in the heat of summer, which we'll touch on again. But there are so many great reasons to container garden. So how do we have a successful container garden? And we really want to start with thinking about where we're going to place it and what we want in it. So we want to make sure we use plants that have similar requirements. We want to make sure that they have the same moisture requirements. You don't want to plant something that requires a lot of water next to something that likes the water, or likes the soil dry. So make sure that the moisture requirements of all your plants works well together. Same with your soil. If you have a plant that likes heavier soils, it might not want to be with something that likes really light soils. Or also thinking about plants that like a little bit of a higher pH versus a lower pH. We just kind of want to make sure that the plants will be happy together in the same growing space. Same with light. You're going to plant all your full sun plants together, your full shade plants. We really can't, while containers give us the opportunity to move plants to spaces that don't have soil to work within the ground, we still do have to pay attention to their light requirements and make sure that if something requires full sun, we're still growing it in full sun. And same thing for the shade. And then also think about the full size of the plants you're going to be using, and also how quickly it might take them to mature. So if we have a plant that's going to grow to a very large, mature size, and it's in a container, it could take that over. And so wanting to plan for something that's going to be appropriate for whatever size container you chose, and then also making sure that whoever it's planted with in the container, that they're all going to grow relatively at the same rate. So that way one doesn't grow super fast and fill in the whole pot, and then the other plants that are in there don't get a chance to grow because they've been crowded out super quickly. So just making sure that everybody will play well together in the container. And then when we think of the proportion of our overall composition, we like to have about 2/3 of the full composition from the ground to the very top of the plant, of the tallest plant, be plants, and then about 1/3 of it the container. And this is just a general suggestion. There's always exceptions, and we'll look at some of those. But in general, you want to see more of the plants than you do of the container. So by having the plants take over more of your field of view, it generally just draws more attention and is more eye pleasing. But of course, there are exceptions, and we'll look at some of those as well. So what are some considerations we need to make when choosing the actual container? And truthfully, anything that can hold soil and has some drainage holes will work. You may have, if you're ever walking around your neighborhood, you may see some fun containers, maybe an old wheelbarrow, maybe an old pair of rain boots. There's a lot of fun things you can use for containers. We just want to make sure that it will hold the soil and that it has some drainage so that there's no issues when it comes to watering. And then size, depending on your space, you want to really think about what size of container will fill your space best. And also think about what you might want to grow as far as what size container you would need to accommodate that. But in general, if you have a smaller container, you're going to fit less plants and it will dry out faster because the plants will use up that moisture quicker since it doesn't hold as much moisture. And then larger containers, you can have more plants and it will hold more water. And it also will hold more of your potting soil. And so the roots will have more space to grow, making them a little bit happier. So it is nice to use larger containers, a little bit lower maintenance again because of the watering. It'll hold more water, but you know, you don't necessarily want something that's going to be too difficult to manage if it's a huge container. Then think about the material of the container. Clay pots and fiber liners, like those coir liners that we see in hanging baskets or like the window planters often, those are going to dry out faster because the moisture can wick. Whereas something like a plastic or a glazed piece of pottery container, those are going to dry out slower because the moisture is kept within there. So those are other things to consider. Along with that material, think about the durability of the material. Are you going to be growing something that you want to overwinter in the container? You know, if you have, I have a couple small dwarf blueberry shrubs, and so they overwinter outside because they need the chilling. And so I want to make sure that my container will stay outside. I also have a container that I use by the front door that gets changed out, and I use it for winter to have evergreens in it. So you want to make sure that your container, if you're going to leave it outside, is going to be durable. You know, a really sturdy container like a resin or a wood planter that will be able to take the winter temperatures is good. Whereas if you're using a clay pot or some really nice pottery, that might, with the expanding and thawing, might crack over winter. So if you have nicer like pottery type containers that could crack in the winter, those are the type of things you want to think about bringing inside. And again, that has to do with size as well. If it's too large that you can't move it, you want to make sure it's going to be durable. Whereas if it's smaller and you can easily move it indoors and out, you can really think about how it's going to overwinter. And then our soil and fertilizer is very important with container gardening, as with all gardening, but we want to make sure we're using a potting medium. A nice quality potting medium will be somewhat light, so that way we have more the roots can easily move through the container. So we want to make sure that it's going to retain moisture and nutrients, as well as still be able to drain. We don't want it so heavy that the water will sit in the container for too long, because that can cause problems, just like if you weren't watering it enough. So we want the potting medium, and they're formulated specifically to retain moisture but still be able to drain nicely. And we also want to make sure with a light potting mix that it's going to provide air space so that the roots can get some oxygen and have some room to grow. So when you're picking up a bag of potting mix, just make sure it specifically says potting medium, potting soil. You don't want to buy just a bag of garden soil or take any out of your garden. That generally does not work as well in containers. And then it really truly is best to replace the soil from year to year. I know that can add to the expense. And so most people probably don't change it out. I know I don't change mine out every year, but it's always good to at least supplement it with some fresh soil. And then we're going to want to make sure we're adding in supplemental fertilizer. The one time that you really truly need to replace all of the soil is if you had disease in that container. If you don't remove the potting soil and there was disease on those plants in the previous year, your plants in the current year are more likely to have problems. So replacing that soil entirely. If everything was healthy, growing okay, we can still use that soil, maybe fluff it up, make sure it's still nice and light, and then supplement it with some compost or some fertilizer, because it will be pretty depleted of its nutrients. So you can find ways to not replace it every year, but just make sure you're thinking primarily about if there was any disease, so that we don't have that issue again. And then you're also going to want to fertilize your plants growing in containers pretty regularly. With plants growing in a container, they're really confined to that space. And so whatever nutrients are in that space is all they can get. Whereas plants growing in the ground, their roots can search out, can stretch and search for more nutrients. Whereas in a container, they only have what's in there. So starting with either a potting mix that has some fertilizer mixed in, or starting with some compost in there, adding some compost in, or adding in a slow release fertilizer is really going to give your plants a nice start. So that way they have some nutrients to begin with. And with the slow release, it's granular. It'll release a little bit of nutrients every time you water, but it's only going to last for so long. So look at your label, see, is it going to last 30 days? Is it going to last 60 days? Remember that every time you water it, a little bit of those nutrients are coming out. So if you have to water frequently, you might be using up those nutrients quicker than what it says on the package, because you are watering more frequently in like the heat of summer. So what we tend to do is use like a liquid fertilizer throughout the growing season once those slow releases have worn off. And you'll do that, maybe every other week, or follow again the instructions on the package. But adding in those nutrients is really important, because these plants will, they will not grow as well if we're not taking care of them and providing them that nutrition throughout the growing season. And when it comes to watering our plants, again, we really want to start by making sure all the plants in the container have the same watering requirements. And that'll make your job of watering so much easier, because you don't have to think, okay, this plant likes a lot of water, this plant wants it dry. You don't have to worry about that. Everything is the same, and you can water them equally. And then, as with all gardening, it's best to water the plants at the base so that we don't have wet foliage that can lead to disease. And make sure you're watering deeply. So you want to really soak the container so that the water makes its way all the way down. Oftentimes you can water, wait a little bit for all of that water to soak in, water again. Eventually it'll start coming out of the bottom drainage holes, and that's when your container is soaked all the way through. It'll continue to drain out, so that as long as it's not sitting in like a dish, where like you would with a house plant, you want to make sure that it's not sitting in standing water, but you want to make sure the water is all the way through. And then by keeping it out of a dish, it'll help prevent it from being overwatered, which could cause as many problems as underwatering. So just keep that in mind. And then when it comes to summer, especially in our area, the extreme heat, the extreme sun, you might actually need to water your containers more frequently than your garden plants, simply because it only holds so much in that container, and the plants they'll drink it all up pretty quick, and they'll need some more. So in the heat of summer, you could be watering at least once a day. You could be watering twice a day, just to make sure that nothing dries out completely. But if you don't want to focus on watering so much, if you really want it low maintenance, then look for plants that are heat and drought tolerant, and then you don't have to worry about it quite as much. Just remembering that the container will only hold so much water. So even though you're not watering your main garden every day, your containers could still need that extra drink. Caring for your plants. Again, the advantage of potting, putting your plants in a container is that they're raised up off the ground. So caring for your plants is a bit easier just because it is raised up, but you want to continue to deadhead, you want to remove diseased leaves, you want to pinch back, you want to cut back foliage or spent flowers. So caring for your plants would be the same as in the garden, but again, it's almost a little bit easier because it is elevated to some extent. And in containers, plants, they will be limited in their overall growth simply because of their size constraint in that container. But oftentimes with something like coleus or various other plants that are just vigorous growers, they may take over a container pretty quickly. So pinching back and cutting back the ends of the stems will help maintain that size so that it is more in proportion to everything else in the container. In the landscape, you might let coleus just go and do its thing and get as big as it can, and that's great. But sometimes in a container, you don't want it quite that big. And so pinching it back will make it fuller and kind of keep the size more manageable for their space that they're growing in containers. So to create interesting containers, we really want to have some variance in shape, in size, in texture, in the colors that we're using. And that just creates a lot of movement and is more appealing to the eye. And we often do this through using a filler, a spiller, and a thriller, a filler, and a spiller. So your thriller is going to be really tall and showy. It's going to be what grabs your eye first. Oftentimes, it'd be something tall like a grass or maybe elephant ears, something that's really fun and that you can see kind of towering above everything else. Your filler is more rounded in shape and it takes up that center area. It makes sure that there's no bare spots in the composition. There's no soil peeking through. So it does its job of filling in the container. And then the spiller is what's going to be hanging over the side. And that's what brings your eye down and kind of hides the container. So if you have an inexpensive container that you don't necessarily need to show off, don't want to show off, using a nice spiller is what's going to hide that for you. So you don't have to worry about buying a nice looking container. You can really hide it with your spiller. And again, there are always exceptions to these guidelines, and we will look at some examples of that as well. Another way to make sure you have nice appealing, eye-pleasing containers is really thinking about color. And so what colors you're using can really convey different feelings and give a different mood to your container and to the space you've got it growing in. So color is simply the visual response of your eyes to reflected rays of light, and that's what gives us our color wheel. The warm colors, red, orange, and yellow, they're really exciting. They draw you towards the garden. You can't miss them. They're the ones that really say, oh, wow, look at me. And so warm colors give that really exciting look to your container, to your composition. Whereas cool colors, green, blue, and violet, are a little bit more relaxing. They're calming. They tend to recede in a garden. And so if it's something that you really want to stand out, you might need to add in a warm color with your cool color. So that way it doesn't sort of fade away and just disappear from sight. But if you want a nice relaxing container sitting on your back patio so that you can relax in the evening outside, using those cool colors is a nice way to give off that feeling. Now, violet is midway between the warm and the cool hues, so it can really give off either mood. Same with green. You've got really bright, vibrant chartreusey greens that are more warm than they are cool. But violet is oftentimes one of those colors that if it's a bright violet, a bright purple, it's more exciting. Whereas if it's more of a grayish purple, very muted, that's where it goes into that calming feeling and can recede to the eye. So if we look at different color harmonies, different groupings of specific colors, specific hues, or their values, the lightness or darkness of one specific hue, that's where we can look at different harmonies in order to put together a nice composition. So monochromatic would be a grouping of different values, different lightness and darkness of a specific hue. So if we're looking at red, we've got red, mauve, pink, light pink, all of those together would be monochromatic. They're all of that red hue, but just different values of it. Analogous is a grouping of 3 adjacent hues on the color wheel. So you've got red, orange, and orange. They're all next to each other. They're all very similar, but you are crossing over into another hue. So it's not just looking at different values. It's 3 adjacent hues. And then complementary would be directly opposite of each other on the color wheel. So red and green, violet and yellow, blue and orange. Think about sports teams. A lot of times, sports teams, different logos and mascots would be complementary colors because it's just that stark contrast. It gives you your warm and your cool color, and it just makes your eye really drawn to it. And then polychromatic would just be a multicolored group, just different hues. There's not really a rhyme or reason to it. They're unrelated on the color wheel, but you just kind of mix in whatever different colors you might like. So let's look at a few examples of those. So monochromatic, here we're looking at different shades of pinks and red. Again, different values of that hue, the red hue. So we have kind of a darker pink, almost red in the foliage, in the purple perilla. And we've got the more hot pink in the geranium in the center there. You've got light pink, and then an even lighter, almost white in the angelonia. So we've got different values of pinks in this composition. And then analogous. So we've got 3 different adjacent colors or adjacent hues on the color wheel. If we're looking at this planter on the left, if we look top down, the top kind of plants, so you've got this very fuchsia red color mandevilla. You go down just another step. You go from red down a step to red violet with this coleus. And then down one more step, and you've got the violet, that true purple with the purple prince alternathera. And so we're going red, violet, violet in the left here. And then on the right-hand side in this container, we've got a very pink calibrachoa. And then if we go to the next adjacent color, it'd be red, orange. And that we have in another calibrachoa. So we've got the pink orange, the red orange, and then a true bright orange in the marigold. So we've got those 3 adjacent colors right there. Complementary, these again are the opposites, and that could be done with foliage a lot too. So here we've got red and green, and we've got the dark red flowers and foliage on this begonia, as well as the bright red flowers on this canary wings begonia, and we've got red and green in the coleus. And so those directly opposite each other on the color wheel. And then here, purple and yellow with the pansies directly opposite each other as well. And then polychromatic, just different colors, not necessarily a rhyme or reason. We've got red and yellow and violet. It's almost primary if we would have had blue instead of violet, but it's just a grouping of different colors that aren't necessarily related to each other in another one of those color harmonies. So let's look at some other examples of interesting containers here. Obviously different scales. So you can have really large containers like here, or we can have smaller containers at home. So let's look at a few different ways to use those. You can, now again, I said there's always exceptions to the different guidelines, but here's just a nice simple monoplanting of marigolds where we've got 3 different colors. They're separated by the steps, so they're each a little bit, one's higher than the next, and it makes a really nice look, even though it's just one single plant in each container. Another good example here, we've got orange, orange, and yellow, so another analogous color scheme. And here we've got the mono plantings, but separated by that step, it really just gives it a nice look, so that way they stand out from each other, and yet they work well together in separate containers. We can also use our colors and our different plants to create different themes and different feelings. And using containers is another way to add in colors that we might not easily find in the plant world. And so this is a great example. You know, we can't always find a nice true blue. So to get this patriotic look, using a nice blue container with the impatiens is a way to get that color that we wouldn't be able to get in a plant. So the red, white, and blue, adding in the interest of the container. We're not hiding the container here, so we don't really have that spilling effect, but it's a way to show off the container. So again, another little bit of an exception to that guideline. Tropicals are great to be grown in containers. It gives us that feeling of being somewhere warm and sunny and by a beach, even though we're here in the Midwest. And so utilizing tropicals in containers is great, depending on what size of container you have. It's something that can be moved indoors and out. You can try to overwinter it then, where it wouldn't be able to overwinter outdoors. So if you have it in a small enough container, you can try to overwinter as a house plant your tropicals. But there's just something about seeing tropical plants, you know, in your backyard, on your patio, by a pool, that really just brings you to a different place, as opposed to being right here in the Midwest. So tropicals are great to work in to containers as well. Another great way to utilize containers is by planting through the different seasons. So when you have a cool season planter in the spring, it gives you that pop of color that you wouldn't be able to get in the ground because the soil's not ready to be worked. It's still too cool for the plants. The soil in the container will warm up faster since it's not in the ground. So we're able to get some nice spring planters, you know, with pansies or dianthus a little bit quicker than we would in the ground. So you start with your spring container. You can have bright, fun summer containers. Another good example, not that this container isn't showy and pretty to look at, but we've really got it covered here, which is a nice way to hide containers if you don't want to show it off, or a way to just increase the impact of the plants by letting them hang over that much. But having a nice bright summer container, transitioning to a fall container, we're able to grow a little bit longer, using your mums, your kale, your pansies again. Ornamental peppers are always fun. So having a fall container is always nice to kind of extend your season a little bit longer when maybe your summer garden is starting to fade. And then in winter, of course, you can use evergreens. You can also utilize edibles to make interesting containers. And I'm not talking about necessarily growing an edible container garden. You can grow tomatoes in a nice large pot. You can grow lettuces in a pot, but by incorporating edibles into a more ornamental container, not to say you can't harvest the edible out of there, you certainly can, but it does add some extra interest. So here using different kales, using some Swiss chard, just adds a little bit more interest. And another great way to use edibles is with herbs. So we've got a nice purple basil here. And you can see by this planting, it's in a garden, but by elevating it above, it just gives more impact and more flower power, even higher than everything else growing in the ground. So another fun way to utilize containers and to utilize edibles as an ornamental. Other fun containers, pallets are becoming really popular and trendy. So you can grow your plants spilling out of a pallet container. So the blanket flower here, we've got zinnias here with, again, some more edibles, the Swiss chard at the top, coming out of the top, just creates a really fun and unique display for your garden. And then another example would be like a wall of plants, a green living wall. They're becoming, trendy, popular. They have been for a bit, but it's a way to grow vertically in a space that you normally couldn't. So this is at the trial gardens at Ball Horticultural, and it's just really beautiful in person, but it just makes such an impact to have those vertical plants growing as a backdrop, as a wall to the this is a patio area. So fun ways to utilize containers. Some photo credits here. I did not take all the photos and used some from Ball Horticultural and Proven Winners. Some additional resources, if you want to get some container ideas, some recipes to use, there's a few places where you can actually search for, I want a sun container in the spring, or I want a sun container in the fall, and it'll give you some recipes of what you want to use, and you could use that as guidelines for what to pick out. And it from University of Illinois Extension, there's a website where just gives you general tips as well. So that way, if you might be having trouble in your container garden, you can maybe troubleshoot it with some information there. And then if you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email, give a call over to our office, or stop on out. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. And thanks so much for inviting me to do this. I hope you're able to put together some nice containers. I'm certainly ready for container gardening season, ready to see some color again. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam, for that informative talk. And thank you all for joining us.